This episode was recorded online, so sound quality may be variable. I apologise for any inconvenience. Kia ora and welcome to this episode of the Jane Austenite. I'm Frances Duncan, an author and the founder of the Jane Austen Society of New Zealand / Aotearoa. With me today is my very special guest, my friend Bob Newell, who is also an author and the founder of the Hawai'i chapter of the Jane Austen Society of North America. Welcome, Bob.
Hi, Francis. It's nice to be here.
Would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about you?
As you mentioned, I am the founder of the Hawaii region of the Jane Austen Society of North America. That happened in 2013, more or less on a whim, when I was corresponding with another Jane Austen fan who said, "You really ought to start a chapter in Hawaii." There had never been one. I thought she was kind of joking, but it actually turned out to be a very good idea. And here we are 9 years later.
History was made.
I've been very successful. I was the leader, the regional coordinator for 8 years and recently stepped down. So that's been a success. I've had a nearly lifelong interest in Jane Austen. My interest in Jane Austen dates back to when I was about 12 or 13 years old in 8th grade in the American school system. Our class was all dragged off to see a stage performance of Pride and Prejudice. We went there thinking we were going to just hate it. It just turned out to be wonderful, and I started to wonder about who is this Elizabeth Bennet that stayed with me for, forever. And as time went on, I read the novels, and the interest just grows and grows, as if you're an Austen fan yourself, I'm sure you'll be familiar with. In fact, it grew to the extent that I started reading Jane Austen fan fiction, and at that point decided I would try writing some of my own. So I did do that. I've published a couple of novels, self-published on Amazon. We can talk about that later if you like. And have some more in progress along the same lines.
So today we're going to be discussing letter 17 of Lady Susan by Jane Austen, and Bob has agreed to read it for us.
So letter 17 from Mrs. Vernon to Lady de Courcy. And the byline on the letter is Churchill. My dear mother, Mr. Vernon returned on Thursday night, bringing his niece with him. Lady Susan had received a line from him by that day's post, informing her that Miss Summers had absolutely refused to allow of Miss Vernon's continuance in her academy. We were therefore prepared for her arrival and expected them impatiently the whole evening. They came while we were at tea, and I never saw any creature look so frightened as Frederica when she entered the room. Lady Susan, who had been shedding tears before, and showing great agitation at the idea of the meeting, received her with perfect self-command and without betraying the least tenderness of spirit. She hardly spoke to her, and on Frederica's bursting into tears as soon as we were seated, took her out of the room and did not return for some time. When she did, her eyes looked very red, and she was as much agitated as before. We saw no more of her daughter. Poor Reginald was beyond measure concerned to see his fair friend in such distress, and watched her with so much tender solicitude that I, who occasionally caught her observing his countenance with exultation, was quite out of patience. This pathetic representation lasted the whole evening, and so ostentatious and artful a display has entirely convinced me that she did, in fact, feel nothing. I am more angry with her than ever since I have seen her daughter. Lady Susan is surely too severe, for Frederica does not seem to have the sort of temper to make severity necessary. She looks perfectly timid, dejected, and penitent. She is very pretty, though not so handsome as her mother, nor at all like her. Her complexion is delicate, but not so fair nor blooming as Lady Susan's. And she has quite the Vernon cast of countenance, the oval face and mild dark eyes, and there is peculiar sweetness in her look when she speaks either to her uncle or me, for as we behave kindly to her, we of course engaged her gratitude. Her mother has insinuated that her temper is intractable, but I never saw a face less indicative of any evil disposition than hers. And from what I can see of the behavior of each to the other, the invariable severity of Lady Susan and the silent dejection of Frederica, I am led to believe as heretofore, that the former has no real love for her daughter, and has never done her justice or treated her affectionately. I have not been able to have any conversation with my niece. She is shy, and I think I can see that some pains are taken to prevent her being much with me. Nothing satisfactory transpires as to her reason for running away. Her kind-hearted uncle, you may be sure, was too fearful of distressing her to ask many questions as they traveled. I wish it had been possible for me to fetch her instead of him. I think I should have discovered the truth in the course of a 30-mile journey. The small pianoforte has been removed within these few days, at Lady Susan's request, into her dressing room, and Frederica spends great part of the day there, practicing it as it is called, but I seldom hear any noise when I pass that way. What she does with herself there, I do not know. There are plenty of books, but it is not every girl who has been running wild all the first 15 years of her life that can or will read. Poor creature. The prospect from her window is not very instructive, for that room overlooks the lawn, with the shrubbery on one side, where she may see her mother walking for an hour together in earnest conversation with Reginald. A girl of Frederica's age must be childish indeed if such things do not strike her. Is it not inexcusable to give such an example to a daughter? Yet Reginald still thinks Lady Susan the best of mothers and still condemns Frederica as a worthless girl. He is convinced that her attempt to run away proceeded from no justifiable cause and had no provocation. I am sure I cannot say that it had. But while Miss Summers declares that Miss Vernon showed no signs of obstinacy or perverseness during her whole stay in Wigmore Street till she was detected in this scheme, I cannot so readily credit what Lady Susan has made him, and wants to make me believe that it was merely an impatience of restraint and a desire of escaping from the tuition of masters which brought on the plan of an elopement. Oh, Reginald, how is your judgment enslaved? He scarcely dares even to allow her to be handsome, and when I speak of her beauty, replies only that her eyes have no brilliancy. Sometimes he is sure she is deficient in understanding, and at others that her temper only is in fault. In short, when a person is always to deceive, it is impossible to be consistent. Lady Susan finds it necessary that Frederica should be to blame, and probably has sometimes judged it to be expedient to excuse her of ill nature, and sometimes to lament her want of sense. Reginald is only repeating after her ladyship. I remain, etc., etc., Catherine Vernon.
So here's something I've been asking people recently. Do you enjoy this novel?
Kind of. There are a number of things I can say about it. One is that if you've seen the movie of Lady Susan, which was mistitled Love and Friendship, this movie came out a few years ago. I think the film was actually better than the written story, which is very unusual. Most Jane Austen films don't even come close to being equal to the novels. We have to understand that this is something she wrote early in her career. And of course, it's an epistolary novel, as the very first novels were, like Clarissa, for instance, considered to be the first English novel. That was epistolary and also actually quite hard to read. I do find Lady Susan quite hard to read. The prose is very dense. It is hard, at first at least, to identify the characters because they just appear in letters, and you don't get much of a sense of who's who. For the longest time, I wondered who's Alicia Johnson. He just sort of shows up as a correspondent with Lady Susan, and you don't learn a lot more. But there's one very interesting observation about the epistolary novel style. If you look at how novel writing has evolved over the centuries, if you look at what's considered modern today, it's rapid alternation of viewpoint. One chapter is written first-person point of view of one character. The next chapter, another. It may alternate between two characters or three or some number. And that is exactly what an epistolary novel does. So is this the old become new again? I don't know. The modern novels are much easier to read, probably because the prose is less dense, because the layout is less crowded, because there's a little more narrative description, which is not possible in the letter format. So when I say my enjoyment of the novel is qualified, I much like the story. I much like the character of Lady Susan, who's a fascinating, evil, clever person, and you can compare her with many of, perhaps, of Jane Austen's later characters, but none is the star of the show, so to speak, in later novels. It's a good story, a little hard to read.
It's interesting that you mentioned that things may be going back more to the way they were with the epistolary novel. I have read a novel which was all email, so similar sort of thing. I think it was written by, I'm probably going to pronounce her surname wrong. I always say Meg Cabot, but I suspect it's something like Meg Cabot. She's the author of The Princess Diaries. Can't remember the title of the novel, but it was really good. And the same sort of, you didn't get all of the details, but you got little hints of things that had happened because of the way that it was told, and yes, the switching perspectives. The dual perspective thing is very popular, in particular in romance novels, having the main character and the love interest, or two main characters, switching between the two chapter to chapter. Have you ever written anything that's dual perspective?
Well, my first novel, Courting Jane, was written in dual perspective. The perspective of Jane Austen and the perspective of her suitor, or erstwhile suitor, I guess we would say. I found that, to me at least, have a bit of an experimental feel to it, but it was kind of fun to do. And of course, as I mentioned, we're seeing this more and more in modern fiction today. In fact, almost to the point that your head starts spinning because the changes of viewpoint are so rapid. If there are enough different viewpoints, then you really wonder who's who anymore, just like you would in an epistolary novel.
I think one of the great things about having an epistolary novel is that having an unreliable narrator is an easier thing to produce. Unless you're writing in first person, it tends to be hard to get an unreliable narrator working well. But when someone is writing letters, you only know what they're telling you and what they're telling their correspondent.
As you know yourself as a writer, from a writer's standpoint, it lets you get away with more inconsistencies in your story. You're not constantly going back to make sure everything fits. That is a key point. We see the contrast very strongly in Lady Susan. We listen to Lady Susan as she writes about her daughter or any of those topics. And then we hear Catherine Vernon's viewpoint. At the different points, we hear other viewpoints. And they're night and day different. You wonder if they're living in the same world. And of course, that's all deliberate, and I think it works extremely well.
I think that Mrs. Vernon sees through Lady Susan too easily. Like, you can see it in this letter. She talks about her shedding tears and having great agitation, but doesn't portray the least tenderness of spirit when Frederica turns up. And she turns back up after sending Frederica to her room with her eyes red, but doesn't cry again. She watches Lady Susan observing Reggie and his countenance with exultation, was so ostentatious and artful display that entirely convinced me, Mrs. Vernon, that she did in fact feel nothing. How is she seeing through Lady Susan so clearly when no one else in the household is?
That didn't bother me at all, actually. Catherine Vernon is the adult in the room, so to speak. She's the sensitive person in the room. She's the one that tunes into other people's feelings and emotions. This is not something that everyone does, but some people are very sensitive to these things. And here I thought that, in a way, Jane is really writing about herself because she was like that. If you read her correspondence, she was very acutely aware of the games that people were playing and their little deceptions, and she had a great time making fun of them, which is a whole other topic. I think Catherine Vernon is the one who gets it. And there is a place for that person in the novel because that centers the novel. When we hear Catherine Vernon speaking, we know we're going down the midline of truth as opposed to all these extremes that we hear from Lady Susan and the rest of the cast.
Do you think it's something about possibly that Lady Susan is not using her powers on Mrs. Vernon, or perhaps she's not as good at manipulating women as she is men? But then when we consider Mrs. Johnson, is she the same sort of character as Lady Susan, or is she herself also being manipulated by Lady Susan?
I don't think the novel really tells you enough about Mrs. Johnson to let you figure that out. There is no question that Lady Susan is masterful at manipulating men. She lives for that. She does it extremely well. To this point in the novel, there isn't a single man who she hasn't manipulated in one way or another, and with success.
I love that about her. It's so fantastic. Well, considering she's a woman in a time, women have always been restricted, but this is much more restricted time than it is now, that she's found a way to create power for herself.
Yes, absolutely. I was just going to say something similar to that. She has found a way to create power for herself. And really, before we judge her too harshly, she's finding a way to survive. If you read carefully enough, not even that carefully, you'll know that her survival is at stake. She's lost her husband, and what does a woman in that time in England do without a husband? You've got a problem. You live off of relatives, you're the modern equivalent of couch surfing. She is being manipulative with an ulterior motive that we can't question 100%. Now, you could question some of the things that she actually does, Manipulating someone else's husband is probably a little bit over the line even in modern society. Nevertheless, we see where she's coming from.
Mrs. Vernon is really sarcastic, I think, referring to Lady Susan as Reginald's fair friend and him looking at her with such tender solicitude. I think she's mocking her brother, and she goes on to say, "Oh, Reginald, how is your judgment enslaved? Lady Susan has made him and wants to make me believe that this was merely an impatience of restraint. She's the one running the narrative." But she's unable to be consistent. She keeps changing the story about why Frederica has run away from school. And Mrs. Vernon points out, she's very clear about this. When a person is always to deceive, it is impossible to be consistent. She sees right through Lady Susan and knows, well, that argument wasn't working at that point, so you tried something else. She sees really clearly, which I think we've seen in previous letters, that Reginald is only repeating after her ladyship. He's her parrot.
Is she being unduly harsh on her brother? I don't know. I think she's disappointed with him. She's disappointed with his lack of judgment, lack of discretion. But again, I see Jane all over in Catherine. The way she does mock and make fun of things, and in the form of a letter, exactly as Jane did so many, many times. Lady Susan, on the other hand, will adapt her story to whatever she thinks the listener needs to hear. Do the stories change frequently? Well, sure they do. They'll change with who she's talking with. They'll change with the particular circumstances of the discussion and whatever she thinks it takes to basically get her way. And as I say, she's masterful at this. She doesn't care if she's consistent. She just cares about getting what she wants.
I think that's pretty reasonable. And I think it's a general thing, right? People care about outcome. Normally, people would care about whether they were hurting people in pursuit of that outcome, but I don't think Lady Susan is like that.
Lady Susan sees herself as number one more than most people will. Anything goes for the success of number one, but as I said earlier, it is for her also about survival. We might judge her 75%, 80%, but I don't think we can judge her quite 100% because she is in dire circumstances. She basically has no money. She can't pay for Frederica's tuition, even if Miss Summers would take her back. It's not easy for Lady Susan. And here I am sympathizing with her when she's a very unlikable character. But every story has two sides, and I think Jane is showing us that.
That's good writing, right? You're not the first person. We've had many people who have talked about, but also she's just doing the best that she can in the current circumstances. What you were saying about her putting herself first made me think about main characters, because Lady Susan is very much the main character of the story, but she's also the main character in her life, and not everybody is like that. I think other authors would have made Frederica the main character of this story. She's more the classic heroine. She is dealing with hardships on all sides and pressures, and she gets the happy ending. So it's an interesting choice to place Lady Susan in this role. Later on, in particular in Mansfield Park, Jane Austen writes Fanny Price as the main character, and Fanny Price doesn't really have main character energy. She's very introverted and quiet. You want someone with a bigger personality to be the main character.
Well, yeah, in Mansfield Park, which is by just about every poll the least popular of Jane Austen's novels. And that's because of Fanny Price being considered by many as a weak heroine, and also just too good to be true. I don't know that Frederica is too good to be true, but she certainly is a weak heroine, at least as she's presented in the story. Now, would she be the logical person to be the heroine where, she's fundamentally a good person, she's under attack by her mother, she's thrown around from here to there, she's only 16, she's having trouble even barely getting started. Would she have made a good heroine? Well, she would have had to have been a lot stronger. That would have happened if Jane had made the conscious decision up front to make her the heroine, which she didn't. So it didn't happen. So, it's sort of a circular argument in a way. What's fascinating about Lady Susan being the main character is that it's the only time Jane has done this. She's had evil women in some of the other novels, and they get their comeuppance in one way or another, but they were by no means the main character. You look at Pride and Prejudice, who's the main character? Of course it's Elizabeth. It's not Miss Bingley. She's the evil person in that novel. She's a very good character, and we understand her well, but Elizabeth is without a doubt the main character. Only in Lady Susan is the bad person, the star of the show, and it's fascinating.
I would have loved to read the sort of novels that Jane Austen would have written had she not been writing what we call now writing to market. I think there was a certain number of choices that she was making so that her books would be palatable and potentially popular, because she did want to make money. She still got her own word in there, but she may have made different choices. Was she not trying to cater to popular opinion?
She might have. I think I would almost argue a little bit how much she was catering to popular opinion, particularly in her later novels. Mansfield Park got pretty dark in places.
But it was very popular at the time.
Yeah, I suppose so. But I don't know that she wrote that to market necessarily. It's possible. If you read the fragment of Sanditon, that was also going off in kind of a dark direction. Of course, her style evolved the way the style of any author evolves. But yeah, that's an interesting question. If she had just written whatever she felt like writing without worrying about would it sell, that would have been, I wonder what it would have been also. I think it would have been more character studies of human nature.
You've talked a little bit about Jane Austen as a person, and one of the things that I understand about her is, yes, she does have that really sharp wit and she's very sharp eye and tongue. She can see who people are right through them. I think she'd be a great friend and a great gossip, but you don't want to do anything to get on her bad side or anything silly, because she would slay you, probably not to your face. I give her that. She would do it quietly after you've left, and her whole family would be laughing at you. But I think she's a little bit of a snarky bitch, and I love that about her.
I do too. She's got spunk and character. But I think what you say only goes up to a point. That if you became one of her intimates, if you really got to know her and really became a close friend, then she would excuse an awful lot. And she would hold back an awful lot. She doesn't ridicule her sister very much, for instance. Her sister Cassandra in her letters.
So although you could argue that if she ever ridiculed Cassandra, those are the letters that Cassandra destroyed.
Well, we'll never know. We can't rule that out. But I do think if you became one of her intimates, and she had very few, that her approach would be much less snarky.
Mrs. Vernon thinks that she would have discovered the truth about why Frederica fled from school in the course of a 30-mile journey if she had been the one to pick her up. If she'd got her trapped in a carriage, she reckons she would have been able to get the truth out of her. I suspect that may be true. What are your thoughts?
If you look into the world of espionage and intelligence, the technique is called elicitation. And I have a feeling that Catherine Vernon would be expert at elicitation. You know, a process of getting someone to talk about things. And certainly a 30-mile trip in those days would have taken hours. And I think in that amount of time, she would have had enough knowledge and technique to work on Frederica and get her to open up. So I do agree. I think she would have gotten to the bottom of just about everything by the end of a 30-mile journey.
Mrs. Vernon refers to Frederica running away from school as an elopement, but elopement doesn't necessarily mean the same thing that we think it means during this time period.
Correct. I had to read that twice and think, oh, is she eloping with Reginald or something? It apparently simply means running away. And, you know, we won't do any spoilers, but that gets explained a little bit more later on in the story.
Frederica's basically trapped in her mother's room with a piano and some books. And all she can see out the window is her mother and Reginald walking in the shrubbery. Mrs. Vernon says this is an inexcusable example to give a daughter. Why do you think this is inexcusable? They're just walking and they're outside. Is this not acceptable?
Well, they're not chaperoned.
But she's a widow. Should that matter? I stumble over this.
Don't forget the factor of difference in age. That may be one thing that she's referring to there. The only interpretation I could really give it was that Lady Susan was flirting, clearly flirting, obviously flirting, with Reginald in public at every opportunity, despite the difference in age and circumstance. And perhaps that's what Catherine Vernon is objecting to. And setting a bad example for Frederica. It's a bit marginal as an explanation.
My grandmother used to flirt with all of my sister's boyfriends, and she was just that I'm just an innocent old lady, so I can get away with it, which I think is fantastic. But I think maybe the age difference isn't big enough between Lady Susan and Reginald to make it okay.
I mean, there's flirting and there's flirting. A grandma flirting with a teenager, for instance. There's obviously nothing in mind there. It's just fun. I think Lady Susan flirting with Reginald is beyond just having a little fun. She has something in mind longer term.
We don't tend to get many descriptions, physical descriptions of characters in Jane Austen. And we have a bit of a description of Frederica here, and she tends to favour her father's side. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons that her mother might dislike her, because her daughter doesn't look like her. She's not a carbon copy of her. And maybe that might be also a reason that the Vernons in particular, apart from her being, horribly abused by her mother, are drawn to her because she looks like their family.
Well, that's certainly a possibility. I hadn't really given that any thought. Mrs. Vernon in this very letter describes Frederica as not as attractive as Lady Susan. And this despite Catherine's dislike for Lady Susan. So I'm not sure. You may be right. I'm not sure.
Before we finish today, Bob, can you tell us a little bit about the books that you've written?
Sure. I've published 2 novels so far and a lot of other short stories and other things. But of interest to your listeners are the 2 novels I've published, which are Jane Austen fan fiction, at least to a certain degree. One was my first novel, Courting Jane, which is a sort of a time travel romance where a modern fellow goes to a Jane Austen Society annual meeting and gets transported back in time and space to Jane Austen's own time and place. And a romance begins over a period of several visits. That was the first novel, so it has its flaws, but a lot of people have found it interesting to various degrees. My second novel was a retelling of Mansfield Park, but set in modern-day Hawaii. I postulate a movie star family who lives in a wealthy section of Honolulu, adopting a poor girl from a part of the island where that's very poor and very very difficult circumstances. It unfolds a lot like Mansfield Park did, where things go their own way, but there's one member of the family who's sympathetic, and eventually, well, you get the idea. Both novels are available on Amazon in both Kindle form and in paperback form. I joke about how they've sold in the high single digits. They've actually done a little bit better than that. They haven't quite made the New York Times bestseller list, and they haven't been made into a movie, but there's always hope. But if you're interested, do check them out, and perhaps you might find something that is interesting for you to read. I've got a couple more in progress, and hopefully I can report on those before too many more months have passed.
And your website is bobnewell.net, and I will put a link in the notes. Thank you very much for joining us, Bob. It's been lovely to talk to you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that is our discussion of Letter 17 of Lady Susan by Jane Austen. My name's Frances Duncan. You can find the links to my socials in the notes. Thank you for listening, and we wish you happy reading.